Right, welcome everyone to the session about technology and the fragmentation of work. We have a number of people in the room, and we've got quite a few people online and also linked to the SASE event. I will introduce the panel and I'll introduce how the arrangements will work in a few moments. But for now, I'll introduce Professor Jackie O'Reilly, who is going to say a few words on behalf of SASE, who are the co-sponsors and co-hosts of the event.
Hi, welcome to the first of our SASE Salon experiments. So if things don't work out, it's an experiment. We're just trying to practice with all these different ways of hybrid working. So first of all, I'll say a massive thank you to our team Limerick, who've been amazing in organising this, and to Jacob Bromberg at SASE, who has also had a massive input in coordinating it all. And I just wanted to give you a brief summary of the aim of these pre-conference SASE Salon events. These are very much, as I said, an experiment to try and find new ways of us connecting with each other across the SASE community and with other organisations that work in our field. And the aim of these salons are about 4 reasons. One was we want to look at ways of making SASE more green, and what better place to start than in Ireland, the Emerald Isle, so that we can enable connections without having to get on planes. We also want to make SASE more inclusive, so to allow people to talk to each other who may not necessarily always be able to physically get there in person. And thirdly, we wanted to make the content of our work go beyond that of just offered by the conference itself. And with these 2 last aims in mind, some of the way that this will be organised, Tony will explain as well how it will work in person. So we have a panel of speakers that will talk about this fragmented work boundaries and digital disconnections. Then we're going to have, and this was a suggestion from some early career researchers, that we have breakout rooms where you will be randomly allocated with Jacob in control of Star Trek International, Beam Me Somewhere Else, Scotty, into a small breakout room with about 5 or 6 other people. And the aim of this is really to have you can have a chat for about 10 to 15 minutes, either about the themes of the talk, or just to introduce yourselves to each other. And this way we hope we will just encourage more sociability within the community. And then we'll all be zoomed back into a collective session, both in person and online, where we can have a question and answer session, and we'll have some feedback from other panelist correspondents there. And at the end of it all, while the Irish are all going out enjoying themselves, we didn't want to stop the fun there. So Jacob has also organised a spatial chat place, which we'll put a link up at the end of the session to enable you to join us in that kind of sociability room as another experiment. And the 4th aim of these sessions are to have some input into the themes of the conference that we are holding in Amsterdam in person. And the theme that we'll talk about there will be fractious connections. So this particular session is very relevant in looking at what do we mean by connections and disconnections. And other events that were happening in the salons will include discussions on anarchism, fractious feminism, racial capitalism, the Ukraine, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, and we'll have major contributions from Mark Granavetta and Ali Hochschild, and hopefully have another session on Islamic finance, which will take place after the main conference. But with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Tony to welcome us all to Limerick and to introduce the panel. So thank you very much, all of you, for making this work. And Tony will explain how we'll manage all the questions, etc. Okay, that's out from me, Tony.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So Jackie says I'll explain how it'll all work. We'll make it up as we go along. That's usually the best way, in my experience. So in terms of the themes today, I'll comment on a bit of logistics, but I did want to comment that and reinforce that the research that we'll be discussing and talking about today is that type of research which makes potential contributions to wider society and wider social objectives. And in this case, it's around the uses and I'm sure we will hear potential abuses of technology in the particular workplace. And one of the key issues of debate is that we're often referred to by the media, by politicians, about the economic models of how technology improves society. And one of the tensions is that technology is not in and of itself neutral or deterministic. Technology is very much shaped by agency and by people and by institutions, and how those institutions and those agents are embedded within cultural norms and structures of society. And it's those sort of debates and issues that we will be touching on in some small way today. In terms of the logistics, there will be, as Jackie said, it's a bit of an experiment, so there will be a little bit of a breakout in the middle for 10 minutes. So in the room, after the panel have presented some research and debate issues, is to consider them and think of possible issues that you might come back and ask questions to the panel about, rather than wait till the end and just ask questions as people think of them. Have a discussion about what's being said and what's being reported in little groups. Just pair up, just sit in little groups, sit in little clusters. You might want to keep social distancing. If that's your preference, that's fine. Online, you will go into the digital space that Jacob is managing from his SASE office in Paris. I've had this vision of Jacob sitting there looking at the Eiffel Tower with his laptop at a coffee bar. And here we are in this beautiful campus at the University of Limerick. So in terms of introducing the panel, first we will hear from Dr. Caroline Murphy. Caroline is a senior lecturer in employment relations in the Department of Work and Employment Studies here at the Kemi Business School in the University of Limerick. Caroline is also an associate fellow of the Digit Research Centre that Jackie is linked to at the University of Sussex. And Caroline's talk will be about the policy debates about whether workers have the right to disconnect from technology. Then we'll have Dr. Michelle O'Sullivan. Michelle is a senior lecturer in employment relations at the Department of Work and Employment Studies in the Kemi Business School. Michelle is also the chair of the Irish Association of Industrial Relations. She's the co-chair of the Work, Employment and Organisation Special Interest Group of the Academy of Management. Michelle is a member of the Board of Directors of TASK. That's a think tank for action and social change. And Michelle's talk will be looking at how employers' use of technology has impacted the performance of employees during COVID, and that will be evidence and data from the financial service sector. And we have Ada Ponce del Castello, don't know if that was correct or not, is a researcher, senior researcher in new technologies and foresight at the European Institute, the European Trade Union Institute in Brussels. Ada is a lawyer by background. She obtained a European doctorate in law on the regulatory issues of human genetics from the universities of Valencia and Bonn. She holds a master's degree in bioethics and is also a member of the Competent Authorities subgroup to regulate nanomaterials of the European Commission. Ada is a member of the OECD's Working Party on Nanotechnologies and is an expert on legal, ethical, social and regulatory issues of emerging technologies. And while I've got the floor, maybe just to record the thanks to several people, including Jackie, as the SASE president, to Jacob, who is managing the Zoom and online links, but also in Limerick, to Rebecca, who has certainly helped bring the event to its conclusion today, Gary from IT, Richard from the IT service department, and a few other people who I'm probably not familiar with the names who've managed to bring this technology together. So that's a general introduction. You probably want to hear from some of the people who know what they're talking about. So I'll introduce Caroline.
Great, thank you, Tony. So in today's talk, I'm going to discuss the introduction of the Code of Practice on Right to Disconnect in the Irish context. And that was introduced just a little over a year ago now. So in the presentation, I'll discuss some of the working time concerns amongst workers which gave rise to calls for the introduction of that Code of Practice. I'll outline how it's been operationalised here in the Irish context, and finally I'll provide an overview of maybe how this Code of Practice is actually taking effect in reality through looking at survey and interview findings from workers in the finance sector. And that was a survey we undertook of over 1,000 workers in the financial services sector in conjunction with the Financial Services Union here in Ireland. And that was a wider study in the business school, including myself, Michelle O'Sullivan, Tony Dundon, Juliette McMahon, Lorraine Ryan, and Dr. Jonathan Lavelle in the business school. For some time now, ever before the pandemic, we were well aware of the impact that technology was having on working time, particularly in terms of it encroaching on personal private time, individuals having concerns that it was leading to work extension as part of their working day. We heard more and more reference to time poverty in people's working lives as technology was leading to the more prevalent use and I suppose prevalence of an always-on culture across organisations. We saw a rise to terminology like the availability fixation, which is now seen as prevalent in neoliberal society, where individuals are biased towards being always available through their connected devices, and where the ability and also the desire to actually be able to disconnect from work and disengage from work is limited. So in the absence of a European regulatory framework around a right to disconnect, and given some of the constraints and seeming insufficiencies in the Irish legislation, back in 2019, the Financial Services Union called on the Irish government to formally legislate for a right to disconnect. Some time passed, and of course the onset of the pandemic immediately exacerbated many of the concerns that had led to that call in the first place. The calls for right to disconnect intensified amid home and remote working, and as part of the government's Making Remote Work national strategy, they committed to the introduction of a code of practice on the right to disconnect through the Workplace Relations Commission in April of last year. So what did that code deliver? Well, essentially the code really emphasises three specific things. It emphasises the right not to routinely work outside of normal hours. It emphasises the right not to be penalised for asserting one's right to disconnect and disengage from work outside of contracted hours. And it emphasises the importance of respecting colleagues' working time and their right to disconnect. So as part of the right to disconnect, employers are expected to provide more detailed information on working hours. The emphasis on maintaining records of working hours and rest breaks is reinforced. And again, a very specific emphasis is placed on not ensuring employees are not penalised for asserting a right to disconnect. But interestingly, one of the things the Code of Practice did, maybe more so than other pieces of legislation, is that it really emphasised employees' own role in managing their own working time. So it encouraged employees to be aware of their own working patterns, to take remedial action where where they note that their working patterns are outside of contracted hours. And it also emphasised employees' responsibilities in understanding the impact that their working time activities might have on their colleagues and others' ability to disconnect. So the government, through this Code of Practice, very much emphasised a voluntarist approach, but emphasised the importance of organisations proactively engaging with their own employees or with their employees' representatives in order to co-deliver and co-determine a right to disconnect policy in organisations that would suit the individual needs of that business, that would recognise things like the need to connect across global time zones and the need where there might be legitimate but occasional situations where an individual might need to work outside of contracted hours. So the response to the introduction of the Code of Practice has been largely positive, but there's also been some criticism. And criticisms have included things like the fact that it's seen as a Code of Practice that doesn't adequately recognise how remote working is going to impact a right to disconnect. And as well, it's seen as excessively designating responsibility for the right to disconnect to the business. So in looking then at some of the data that we had from a 2019 survey of workers in the Financial Services Union, we had asked them the question, to what extent did they feel there was an expectation on them to be available to their employer outside of working hours? And at that time in 2019, 25% of the respondents said that they did feel there was an expectation to be available. We ran that question again in October of 21. So that is roughly just 6 months after the Code of Practice was introduced. And that 25% had declined to 19%. So that does point to some positive benefits, to some positive movement in terms of a right to disconnect. But it's important to caveat that finding with the fact that this was a group of workers which were strongly unionised. They're working in a largely unionised part of the financial services sector. And they were part of a trade union, which that trade union itself had been very vocal in calling for a national right to disconnect and had actively engaged in negotiating right to disconnect policies at the local level with its organisations. So if anybody is, I suppose, going to be working in organisations that are doing this well, it's likely to be these employees. So when we look and we see, okay, the number of people who are expected to be available has declined, that seems a good thing. But there are still definitely obvious concerns amongst employees. So when we look at the qualitative comments, for example, many refer to the fact that technology and remote working are driving their need to work outside of their standard contracted hours and to work additional hours. In fact, the survey results showed that only 28% work to their contracted hours. Everybody else worked in excess. Now that varied from anything from 1 to 2 hours per week to in excess of 10 to 12 hours per week every week. But it was also revealed as well through the interviews that very few of these employees are now remunerated for those outside of contracted hours working. So the extent to which overtime is paid, the extent to which on-call allowances are on offer have been greatly reduced through the redesign and more sophisticated design of rewards and performance packages. From the interviews, it appeared obvious that an individual's role had a great impact on the extent to which they had to work outside of working hours. People cited, for example, having managerial or supervisory activities really impacted their ability to get their job done in their contracted hours. They talked about using out of hours working to make up for the fact that there were staff shortages in many of the branches they were working at, and that was causing additional work. Many as well talked about the needs of the business driving out of hours working. So for example, in some of the branches, managers felt the need to release their mobile phone numbers to customers, and those customers would then contact them relatively regularly when they were having issues outside of the standard working day. One of the key findings was that only 31% actually noted that they just did not have enough time in the day to do all of their tasks sufficiently. So that's quite a high number. A third of people reporting that if they were not to work outside of their contracted hours, they probably wouldn't be able to achieve all of their tasks. Some of the staff noted that working outside of hours was starting to feel a little like their normal working routine. 24% said the technology was invading their personal life, while 24% also said they felt the need to engage with work while on leave and holidays in order to keep up. They said things like, you're less likely to switch off when you know you have a massive workload waiting for you in the morning. 28%, however, did point out that they undertook this work as a matter of preference. And that is interesting in that when we look at company culture, it's something I'll come back to and speak about in a couple of minutes. They spoke about the fact that culture was seeming to be do as much as you can for as long as you can. And that seems to be sometimes a message that came from management as one was reinforced from the top down. Employees spoke about things like people engaging with emails, engaging with correspondence while on holidays, whilst on maternity leave. They spoke about global time zones really increasing the pressure to be available for out-of-hours working. But one of the key things was they talked about technology itself as an actual driver of out-of-hours working. So they spoke about the instability of technology, software programs failing, tools freezing, and the downtime that resulted from that period of lost productivity wasn't recognised by the organisation. Deadlines weren't moved, turnaround times weren't extended, and because of that, individuals felt the need to engage with work outside of hours. We asked the question to what extent people felt that being available benefited their careers, and 28% agreed and strongly agreed that being available to their employer, colleagues and customers would definitely impact their career in a positive sense. So they felt there was a belief either explicitly or implicitly amongst senior management that being available showed better potential for promotion and a better willingness to manage your own workload. So they said things like, whilst there is a policy about being able to switch off, the reality is there's much more work going on less shoulders and with tighter deadlines, so switching off isn't an option. They talked about things like performance reviews and how performance is managed now, such that my performance is going to look bad if I don't get this done. So they would make up the work out of time. And finally, they really spoke about the lack of leadership from some of senior management in terms of setting an example. So they said things like, the right to disconnect is vital, but it needs to be implemented and advertised from the top down. We need managers who are meant to go on leave to go on leave. And then they said things as well like the inability to voice their concerns about right to disconnect, even though there was an official policy. One quoted, our senior management team tells us we have the right to disconnect, but it's my manager who doesn't abide. I'm told if my manager isn't cooperating, speak to somebody above my manager, but I wouldn't dare do that for fear of what would happen afterwards. So we see some issues around enforcement and sufficiency here in terms of how the code of practice might actually be working. So as I've said, the research that I've looked at there really was engaged with workers who were in an environment where they are collectivized, they have a strong union, and they have right to disconnect policies which have been introduced. And they're still seeing some of the issues that existed before the code of practice still playing out. So in terms of the code of practice on a right to disconnect, which should give people the right to disengage from work and work-based communications outside of hours, is it working in the Irish context? Well, the code of practice isn't on a legislative footing in that it doesn't bring any new legislation to the table. It simply draws together core elements of existing acts like the Organisation of Working Time and the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work and Employment Miscellaneous Provisions Act. Importantly too, failure to adhere to the code of practice isn't itself a breach. So in other words, employees can't directly bring a case under this code of practice. They would need to bring a different case around working hours, and they could then cite a breach of the code of practice in evidence as part of that. So it has limitations in terms of its enforcement ability and its sufficiency in that regards. But I suppose one of the main issues that we've identified here is the company culture. The fact that culture is reinforcing work intensification, and whether that's being available for work that would directly involve discussing something with somebody else, answering an email, or whether that is just making up additional hours outside of your contracted time, work intensification remains a problem. And Uni Global, when they talk about a right to disconnect, it's one of the key things they emphasize. They say we need to look at the symptoms, not just the causes of why people can't disconnect from work. So in terms of whether or not the right to disconnect has been successful here, I suppose I would close by drawing your attention to a very recent study that has been conducted in just February of 2022. One of the leading law firms here, Mason Hayes Curran, conducted a study, and in that they found that less than 40% of organisations, 63% of organisations still do not have any right to disconnect policy. And it's led them to really comment, has this all been a bit of a non-event? So whilst the code of practice has probably got the conversation going, it's raised greater awareness about the importance of e-communications and working time, it still probably hasn't gone far enough in actually tackling issues around work intensification and ensuring that work and rest time is protected. So I suppose in that old adage, a lot done and a lot more to do, I think, when it comes to working time protections in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And it brings a lot of issues to the fore. In particular, I'm starting to think about voluntarism and the ideas of a code of practice and whether it needs to have more forceful, mandated type of issues. These are some of the debates we'll pick up shortly. But I'll move on to Michelle, if Michelle wants to give an outline of the research you've been looking at in this area.
Thanks, Tony. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the research that Caroline and our colleagues have been involved in with the Financial Services Union, which mostly the respondents are from the retail banks. And we looked at doing interviews before COVID, and we had a large-scale survey during the COVID period. So it's a good time to transverse the patterns during that period. Just to give some context, I mean, one of the key messages that we get, particularly from the banking sector in Ireland and in other European countries as well, is how consumer behaviour is changing the way in which banks act. and their activities, and in particular is driving technology. And in fact, this is one of the key messages behind a recent report done on the future of banking last year for the banking industry in Ireland. In fact, in contrast, if you look at the Economist Intelligence Unit's survey of global banking executives, 2/3 of them mentioned that technology itself, they had a much more deterministic view of changes. And they said that technology itself and the availability of types of technology was driving, the major driver of changes in that sector. And actually they rated consumer behaviour as being much lower down as a driver of change. And higher up in terms of drivers for change was the regulatory context. So how the regulation of technology, that was going to impact a lot the way in which the financial sector does business. But COVID has changed some patterns within the banking sector, there's no doubt about that. So for example, over-the-counter transactions within branches has fallen by up to half across Europe. Digital payments have increased by 65%. So definitely technologies is a key part of changes in the financial services sector. And these were trends which were happening, of course, long before the pandemic. So our survey tried to look at many issues in relation to technology. Technology is quite vast in the financial services sector. We're talking about algorithms, we're talking about automation and robotics, we're talking about more information and communication technology, and we're talking about a lot of different services, of course, within the sector. But I'm just going to focus on, make comments on two aspects that technology is prevalent on. That's remote working and productivity, just taking up some comments that Caroline mentioned earlier. So there's been a significant shift within the financial services sector in Ireland in terms of the levels of remote working. Prior to the pandemic, 3/4 of employees only worked at the employer's premises. And by late 2021, this had fallen to about 28%. And most people who are working outside of the employer's premises are doing so on a full-time basis. And they want to retain that. Close to 90% of employees say that they want to retain a significant level of remote working. And the only people who want to retain home working are often the people who can't because of the nature of their role. And also it was a greater tendency for older workers to want to come to the office more than younger workers. So a significant shift there. We tried to get some sense of their experiences of remote working, and much like literature might already point to, remote working was seen as very favourable in terms of people's levels of autonomy, their ability to be able to time plan, their work-life balance. So there is a bit of a caveat to that in terms of what Caroline mentioned, where you did have about 1/4 to 1/3 of people who mentioned they find it very difficult to get enough time to do the work that they have, and they felt that work interferes with their personal lives as well. So that is a bit of a red flag. A significant issue for employees is the cost element. They received a lot of support from employers in terms of provision of equipment, but the financial cost that they bear in terms of working from home is a significant issue. And it's worth noting as well that when we look at the employer side of things, so if we go back to that report on the future of banking, I mean, they have identified remote and flexible working as one of the key ways in which they're going to try to increasingly reduce costs in the sector. So they identify the continuing need to reduce costs, to increase income, and by reducing property costs associated with office working, remote working is going to facilitate that. They also mention the idea of remote working as being useful in what they say is matching customer and work demands, and also in attracting talent, given the labour shortages that there are across many sectors. So it's hugely beneficial to employers. It's also worth noting that when employers look at the idea of remote working, they're also talking about different workforce models. So employers are talking in that future of banking review about moving from traditional employment to more contingent workforce employment. And therefore, the nature of the usage of the office is going to be different depending on that sort of contingent workforce models that employers use. So cost is a feature both for the workers and for the employers as well. Another issue which is of concern to employees is the issue of careers, and Caroline's already mentioned that with regard to the need to be available to employers. But there was a significant level of uncertainty amongst respondents to the survey about to what extent would home working impact their career opportunities. So that is something that will obviously have to be an issue of concern that will be negotiated with the union and employers. Moving on then a little bit to productivity. It's impossible to talk about technology in the financial sector without talking about restructuring. So banks across Europe have been involved in significant restructuring, particularly since the global financial crisis. We've seen significant falls in the number of physical bank branches and also employees. So between 2007 and 2019, Ireland had the 5th largest drop in the number of employees in retail banks. It dropped by 1/3. And this is likely to continue as well, since we've had, in the Irish context, 2 more banks are going to exit the market, leading to about another 4,000 redundancies. So employment has been a key method by which employers have had to reduce costs. And they note as well that labour costs, and they use the word costs, account for about half of their operating costs. So headcount is a big focus for them. And also, of course, this relates to their ideas about using more flexible employment models, freelancers and so on, as a way of trying to control costs. So restructuring has been a big part which has intertwined the increasing pace of technology. So when you talk to employees, there's a blurred lines between, well, where does technology begin and end, and where does restructuring begin and end? And when you talk about productivity, I suppose we can say there's multiple faces of the impact of technology on productivity. On the one hand, employees believe that technology has been good for productivity in the sense of helping them do their job better. They talk about technology, particularly the robotics and automation, taking away a lot of the mind-numbing work, the monotonous work, the paper filing work. And this leaves them to do other tasks. Now, what those other tasks are very much depend on your occupation. So if you're an underwriter, if you are work in lending, then you can focus on more complex decision-making that robotics can't do. But if you work in the retail banks, there is a significant shift in your tasks towards sales. So there's a shift from the customer service perspective towards a sales perspective, and a big focus in the retail banks on trying to increase income, increase customer acquisitions. And in this sense, I suppose another face of technology is very much related to what we see is a lot of evidence of Korzinski's work on call centers, when they talk about, customer-orientated bureaucracy, where you have these dual and sometimes competing logics between a customer orientation on the one hand and then a drive for efficiency on the other. And you can have a tension between workers' perceptions of how they should deal with customers, how the employees themselves get a sense of satisfaction from trying to help customers, to you have this disembodied view of the customer that employers have. So employers talking about the customer in terms of acquisitions, a return on equity, sales, footfall statistics in terms of technology, and using technology in very rudimentary and in very sophisticated ways to track those kinds of engagements that employees are having with customers. And that drive for efficiency has led to increased intensity of work. So we can see as well that another face of technology is what might be termed a phantom player narrative. And we mentioned the idea of a phantom player. What I mean is, that when someone talks about, uses an idea as a phantom player, they're taking away responsibility for an action away from themselves. They're externalizing responsibility away from themselves. It's not me that's driving this action, it's something else. And from the employee's perspective, they felt that their employers were using technology as an excuse by which to introduce restructuring. And it was also an excuse by which to drive down headcount. So that it was, we have this technology, we shouldn't need the same amount of employees. But for the employees, the reality was quite different. That you do need more employees because the level of work has intensified, the performance targets have intensified. And as well as that, a big issue for employees is that the technology just isn't that reliable. When it works, it's quite good, but it doesn't work often. And you have a lot of complaints about time being wasted on inefficient and broken down technology, that while employers have invested a lot of technology on the customer facing end of things like the apps and so on, they haven't spent or invested as much money on the back end technology, on systems talking to each other. So you have complaints even from the cash tellers and retail banks talking about how systems are breaking down constantly. And they don't have necessarily the capabilities to be able to deal with it. They feel they're made responsible for technology breakdowns, but actually they don't have the answers. And when a customer comes to them looking for answers, what should they do? They don't know the answer, and they don't even know who should they call within their own organization about what to do with it. But you do have this kind of embeddedness of technology, this kind of self-reinforcing cycle. Because of the work intensity that employees are under, particularly in the retail side of things, they have less time to engage with customers. So they're directing customers to use the technology, and therefore you have this self-reinforcing cycle of trying to get customers to using it and it becoming more embedded in the organization. So you have these conflicting tensions employees face between seeing the productivity enhancing related elements of technology and enjoying elements of that, but also seeing how it has increased their level of workload, and that in conjunction with staffing reductions and increasing performance management targets has made life difficult for many employees. And that depends on their occupation as well, of course. So overall what we can see is that technology is multifaceted. It very much depends on the occupation that you have. It also depends on the employer's extent of investment in technology. But overall, employees feel that they don't have a sense of influence. So when we ask employees, well, what type or level of influence do you have in decision-making in the organization? I mean, 3/4 of survey respondents said they have no influence on the introduction of technology in their organization. They have greater levels of influence on other issues. For example, on their location of work, about half of employees have at least some influence over where they work, but very little influence over the extent to which they can have a say in regards to technology. So it's difficult for them, though, to be able to tackle the issues of technology in work because they have all these implications as well of change management and restructuring. So where one issue ends and another begins is quite difficult for them. I will leave it there and hand it back to you, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So again, we can see a whole set of tensions and inflection points between restructuring, between technology, between employer choice, between worker preferences, whether this is regulated, whether these are based on a code of practice, whether they're based on management choice, whether there's social dialogue. These are all the tensions that the social relations of technology and fragmentation and connections in the workplace bring to the fore. And it's on that sort of issue that I'd like to introduce Ada, who is going to give some expert advice on this regulatory dynamic.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony, and thank you, everybody. Thank you for this invitation. Well, I will give you an overview of how technology is being regulated from an European perspective. I work in Brussels, so I will bring in this view. And I will do so in three dimensions. First, the role and the power of the governments or supranational institutions in regulating technology. And then the second, the role and or the power of the industrial actors or the deployers of the technology in putting that into the market, but also in governance. And the third, about the agency of labor or workers in general. So the first I mentioned, what's the role of government in regulating new technologies or artificial intelligence as such. Here we see that we have a very specific role of the supranational organizations like the OECD or the Council of Europe developing governance instruments. And that's being the source of most of what the European Commission in Europe is doing and putting forward in their 20+ legislative initiatives on digitalization, including, of course, artificial intelligence and digital platforms or digital labor platforms. And we see in analyzing all this draft legislation, we see that the European Commission has taken a lot of inspiration from the OECD. The OECD, a couple of years ago, they published their AI trustworthy principles on how AI should be regulated from a kind of value, ethical perspective, putting forward certain values that can be questionable. And then from there, setting the basis, okay, this is what we see that should be regulated in quotation marks. So please feel free, governments around the world, to acquire them and put them into practice, international laws. The European Commission got inspiration from that and drafted the very controversial or very hot topic AI Act, or the regulation on AI, artificial intelligence, which was published or drafted a year ago exactly. Now it's being discussed by the Parliament in different groups. What we see here as a main criticism of the regulations that the European Commission has been putting forward is that they are a product market regulation. They are based on boosting the capacity of the European single market to become a data market, and to boosting also the artificial intelligence sector to become an actual sector as such, which is a very big shift from the single market to this digital market. Europe wants to become a leader on artificial intelligence across the world, and that has a very big geopolitical dimension, which is being a leader vis-a-vis China, naturally, and the US, because we don't have the capacity in Europe to produce semiconductors or to produce big spaces for the clouds to live and to host data. So in that sense, Europe wants to put that digital infrastructure into the game of geopolitics, of course. And in being one way of putting forward the leadership, it's in producing legislation, which is what the European Commission has been doing. My question here is are those 20 plus pieces of legislation really regulatory instruments? Well, and when we look at the regulatory instruments as such, for example, the Digital Markets Act, which regulates the platforms or the big platforms like the GAFAMs, meaning those companies that are able to acquire a lot of customers and to put their products into the market massively. The European Commission calls them the gatekeepers of the platform economy, because they manage to keep their customers for themselves by pushing, making it very difficult for smaller non-US platforms to be competitive and to enter into the market. Well, that Digital Markets Act, which has a sister regulation, which is the Digital Services Act, it's a very good piece of legislation, because it provides some obligations for digital platforms to comply with while they operate in Europe. But the question mark, or my big question is, why don't these regulations regulate the platform business model? That is not really captured in the rationale of the legislator, and this has been a big criticism. Why isn't the business model really regulated? The other piece of regulation that has lots of criticism is the AI Act, which regulates AI systems to be put or sold into the market, in the European market. And here, the regulator has been very clever in putting a lot of obligations to the producers and users of AI systems in the EU, in order to comply issues like transparency, documentation for the users, and all of these obligations have to be done by doing just internal controls. This means that there is no actual national or a European authority who is going to audit or control the systems that are being put into the market, but it's the producer itself who is going to say, my product is fine, I have done the controls, I can put it into the market. And they are going to substantiate those legal requirements through technical standardization. And the second question is, okay, so who is going to produce and develop those technical standards, who are going to detail how the producer is going to put those check and balances and put the product into the market? And when we look at the international standardization bodies, we see that their members are those who are producing the technology. So it's a very interesting relationship, power relationship of control. The controllers are being controllers of their own products, and there is no way in which the regulation is drafted in which other third parties, neutral third parties, or the civil society, let alone societal stakeholders like trade unions, have a role in how standards are being produced. And that's really the shocking part of the regulation. But the control is being, the controllers of the technology are being controlled by themselves. And yeah, so the question is, well, in this regulatory framework, what is left for the individuals, for humans, or for citizens. And most of the privacy, digital activists, trade unions, and civil society in general have been highlighting that, well, there are no really rights in those 20+ pieces of regulations to the human being, to the individual itself, to contest, redress, or just argue that some deployments of technology are just being unfair, or to signal that they might have been hampered by some of the risks in deploying artificial intelligence. So that's the big question coming back from a more individual human rights perspective. There are not really rights. So we can see in general that, well, the supranational institutions are paving the way. The European Commission is just adopting a kind of the regulatory agenda without putting really obligations into producers that are being can be enforced by an authority at any level, national or at the European level. And third, that there is no way or no real redress mechanisms for the individuals to put forward when they think or believe that their rights are being hampered, discrimination, bias, access to employment, gender, etc. All this human rights, but also employment rights that can be hampered by the use of some artificial intelligence systems. Now, the question is, what's the agency of workers? What's the agency of labor in all of this? Well, we know that the digital agenda has not been designed to provide new rights for labor, that's for sure. The European Digital Agenda has not been designed to provide new rights to people, no more human rights or digital rights as such. It has been designed to boost the data market and to make the European region a really competitive region for the global economic landscape. So when we look at the rights that we have in the AI Act or in the new directive regulating digital labor platforms, we see that there is very little rights. Most of them are copy-pasting what we already have in terms of data protection, which is the GDPR, General Regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation that gives access to data, a possibility to redress or rectify, possibility to have more information. And these rights have been transposed in a way to the digital platforms landscape, but with the same difficulties in implementation for the employment context. So basically, workers, if they would like to exercise those rights, they wouldn't know whether they should exercise their rights upon the Data Protection Authority or upon an inspector authority or a labor authority. They wouldn't really know how to produce an access request of their data, whether the employer will have really the obligation to provide them their data or the analyzed metadata of their working time, performance analysis, etc., etc. So it is a very good intention of the legislator to bring the digital rights in GDPR into platform economy regulation, but the implementation and the exercise of those rights are still not really good. In terms of artificial intelligence, there are really nothing that can be used by the workers, and that's really a shame. However, I think that there are other ways in which workers have been exercising their agency. Probably not being so much influential, but there are some leverage. For example, in 2020, the European social partners, meaning the representatives of employers at the European level and the representatives of employees at the European level, got together and agreed to draft an autonomous digitalization agreement, which now has to be implemented, but we don't see a lot of signs of implementation. But the agreement is there, and the agreement has very strong topics on artificial intelligence and on the right to disconnect. So it will be interesting to know how social partners in the different member states will be implementing these agreements and at what level. Another leverage of workers where they can exercise their agency is, for example, the national agreements on the right to disconnect. We know that some countries like France, Spain, Italy have transposed this into concrete agreements. On another note, the Riders Law, which is the Spanish very famous law that regulates digital platforms, has been one example in which trade unions have put forward their regulatory influence, and they have a law in Spain. In the UK, Unite, the union, has a Green Road Agreement on bus drivers. At the international level, because I know this conference is reaching outside the EU, we have other similar GDPR-like legislations in Brazil, in Canada, in Japan, in New Zealand, and in South Africa. And probably these rights could be extended to the labor if trade unions or social partners can make good use of that in those countries. And I have to say that from an EU-US perspective, last year, the EU and the US governments, they established a technology trade council, transatlantic council, in order to look at issues about cybersecurity and standards and all these technical standardization issues that can be done across the Atlantic. Sadly, there are no social issues in these types of negotiations. But my question, just to close my intervention, is how can really policymakers across the globe, not only in the EU, can really address social issues of technology adoption and the social challenges that technology has brought to us? And what are the leverages of workers in order to address issues like working conditions, risks of new and emerging technologies, algorithmic management, and the implementation of new digital rights? So we have new challenges for the world of work, for sure. We have new challenges for the policymakers across Europe, and we see this tendency of having laws, but which, in my view, it's really a deregulatory agenda that is being put in place and being just kind of covered with technical standards, which are governance instruments taking over and over what regulation can do. And with that, I would like to close my intervention. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Ada. Again, rich, fruitful ideas for thought and debate, and challenges, for society, labour market institutions. And it's at that point that brings us to the little experimental part where in the room you can break off and have a little chat, stay in your little groups, don't run away, don't depart and leave us. And on the virtual room, Jacob will put you into a short breakout room, say hello to one another, have a little chat about those issues. It'll be for 10 minutes. So it's almost 3 o'clock. So the breakout room online will send you back in automatically at, say, 3:10 or 10 minutes past the hour, wherever you are in the world. And in this room, we'll reconvene again in 10 minutes. But if you chat amongst yourselves, move yourselves around, do what you want, and we'll pick up some questions and issues and thought at that point. So we'll have our interval. I'll sell ice creams at the front. Yeah. Thanks. Right, so welcome back, everyone, into the room and virtually. Everyone should be returning back to the main plenary room. So this was an intervention. We'll see how it goes. The idea was to stimulate some discussion, to stimulate some thoughts. And at this point, to start this section off, what I want to invite is Gareth Murphy. I'm going to invite Gareth Murphy, who is a trade union leader for the Finance Service Sector Union. And Gareth is going to join us on the screen and give some thoughts and comments to the presentations thus far. So over to Gareth, if that works.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Tony, for the opportunity and the invite to say a few words today. I suppose I want to start on a little bit of a somber note, today is International Workers' Memorial Day. It's a day where we remember workers who've lost their lives or been seriously injured in workplace accidents or incidents. And this morning I attended a memorial with a number of trade unions and employers, and I heard the mother of a worker who died in a construction accident and tell of the trauma that their family has suffered and faced. And the commitment was made from the Irish trade union movement, from the Irish government, from the employers body IBEC, and from the Construction Industry Federation to attempt to eliminate deaths and serious injuries at work by 2030. So not to reduce, but to eliminate all deaths and serious injuries in work by 2030. But what struck me was the question of psychological health and serious injury from psychological damage and mental health, work-related stress, and issues like that in work came up in a number of the conversations with fellow trade unionists and members of the public who were there this morning. So it just strikes me that some of the issues that are being talked about today by the panel will actually need to be addressed if a commitment to eliminate, in particular, serious injuries is actually achieved. Because I see in the financial services extreme cases of mental health damage, poor mental health, and very serious work-related stress that also leads on to a range of physical injuries and damages on workers. Unfortunately, I see too many on a yearly basis that are caused by working conditions. And like I said, it strikes me that I think we're going to have to deal with some of the impact of technology on workers and our health and well-being over the next decade if we're to seriously eliminate those deaths and injuries. I want to thank as well and note the contributions by Caroline and Michelle in particular earlier today. Members of my union, we had a conference in 2018, and technology, stress, pressure, outsourcing, loss of jobs, these issues really came to the fore at that conference in 2018, and delegates and members of our union put forward motions for us to, number one, research the impact of technology on work, but more importantly, given the point is to change the world around us, and to use that research to create demands both at a workplace level, but also demands of our Parliament and government for legislative change. And I'm delighted that the first report that Caroline Michelle, the University of Limerick, Chemie Business School, produced for us in 2019 led directly to the Right to Disconnect campaign that Caroline very clearly articulated before the break. And I think part of our discussion group just talked briefly about the effectiveness of that. And I think time will tell on that code of practice, but absolutely cultural change is fundamentally needed in workplaces to give effect to the right to disconnect. And for us, cultural change comes from two things. Number one, from below, from pressure from below, which is our job as a trade union representing workers and organizing workers. Put pressure from below to demand that kind of respect of working time and working hours, but also then to change leadership at the top to relieve some of the pressure that creates the always on culture that's been described. So I think time will tell how effective we are. I think a weakness in Ireland is our lack of mandatory collective bargaining procedures, because where we have collective bargaining, we have been able to effectively use the code of practice to at least achieve some workplace policies. But many of the workers who do not have trade unions and don't have collective bargaining won't be able to do that. And arguably, they're the workers that require the right to disconnect. more than anyone else. A piece of research that I undertook over the last couple of years as well was looking at performance management. And again, in the breakout room, one of the colleagues that I was in talked about the impact of performance management on academics. So we also looked at the impact of performance management on banking workers. And performance management is increasingly integrated into technology, or technology is increasingly integrated into performance management. And our experience of that is performance management is becoming far more unilateral and top-down, because goals and objectives are pre-populated on tools, and the tools then use stats and lovely, colorful, gamified images to tell you how you are performing. And workers have told me that it becomes harder in your one-to-one appraisals to challenge that and to challenge your manager, because your managers just point to the screen and say, well, look, that is your performance against the objectives and against the stats. And it's much harder to control because the technology is presented as kind of scientific and objective and neutral, and therefore indisputable and unchallengeable. And that's a real challenge that we face, because performance management now impacts not just your rating, it impacts on your pay, it impacts on redundancy selection, it impacts on promotional opportunities, so it impacts on a whole bundle of HR policies that affects your working life. What we did find, however, in contrast to that, because objectives were being imposed via performance management technologies, they were by and large collective rather than individual objectives. So where we were able to collectivize opposition, and in this case, we pursued a collective grievance between the workers supported by the trade union, we were actually able to change particular objectives through collective action. And therefore, what is usually an individual tool of control and management effectively became a collective win for the union in changing a collective objective. So it's that contrast and conflict between what's an individual tool but attempting to collectivize it. And we were successful in this case. However, as we know as trade unionists, collective struggles are very, very difficult and not the majority form of resistance that takes place in work. So that's just a few of my observations. It's a fantastic session and conference, and I think some of the issues raised, from artificial intelligence to remote working, home working allowances, right to disconnect, are really some of the key issues that we're going to face in work and that we're going to face in our work as trade unions. I would like to maybe just end, if I can take advantage of having the floor, Tony, and end with one question maybe to your panel. And it's really just to ask that, given the challenges outlined by the panel in terms of right to disconnect, remote working, surveillance, health and safety, home working allowances, etc., do we feel that health and safety legislation or regulations are really up to the challenge, and are they fit for purpose when we think about technology and how it's impacting work? Because our experience is a lot of health and safety legislation was really written for trips and slips, as opposed to the psychosocial impact of technology on work. So I suppose the question is health and safety legislation fit for purpose, or does it need to be reviewed in light of some of the evidence presented by the panel? And I'll hand back to you, Tony.
So just while the panel, maybe Ada might comment on that, particularly the health and safety angle. While Ada's thinking about that, I'll invite her to respond to Gareth's question about the impetus of health and safety regulation and technology. Is, if there's anyone in the room, if you've got any questions from our little interval, there is a roaming mic. We need you to speak into the mic to so the online people can catch it. If there's anyone online, if you'd like to post questions, if you'd like to post them to Jacob through the Zoom, Jackie will collate some of those. Jackie shortly to see what online questions we've got going on. But in the meantime, while you're thinking of that, and whoever's going to put the hand up in the room first is Ada. Do you have any views on Gareth's question about the the strength of health and safety legislation rather than trips and slips for the social, the psychological of technology?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that at the European level we have a good amount, a good number of directives regulating health and safety that are valid, not because they are all means that they are not fit for work. The accidents still happen, diseases still happen, cancers are still the first disease in Europe and maybe in the world from which workers die. So legislation is still relevant. Of course, we are facing techno stress, more technological developments. We don't see necessarily invisible, like these cameras and algorithms behind all these systems. And those risks attached to these digital technologies are not well understood. And we have so far not been very good at putting psychosocial risks in the regulatory agenda, because the European legislators have been a little bit reluctant to that, although still some good amount of employers' organizations and mostly trade unions recognize the need that something has to be done in a harmonized manner in order to tackle and address them and manage them or prevent them, which is what health and safety is about. It's about prevention. So the part in which the OSH regulation can be updated is on psychosocial risks, and there's a good amount of work from my colleagues doing that. And for the rest, I think it still needs to be implemented, and this is responsibility and accountability of some regulators, policymakers, labor authorities, and even workers and trade unions that need to make that happen.
Thanks very much, Ada. Is there anyone in the room got any comments or questions they want to raise? We've one, Christine, over at the end. So if you get the microphone. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Tony. Just in terms of, to start off, I think I can echo the views of the people in the room. They were three really interesting presentations, very thought-provoking. We talked more at a kind of a macro level when we were having our group discussion, and what really struck us is that you've identified a really strong set of difficulties associated with the situation that we find ourselves in now. So the question is, where do we go next?
Caroline, do you want to pick that up first? Where do we go next with those challenges and difficulties?
Yeah, I suppose if I bring it back to this whole idea of working time, I mean, we know that working time has always been contested within the employment relationship. But much like what Garrett said about health and safety, much of our working time regulation was based for a different era. And not only that, much of our rewards are based out of management systems which were designed for a different era. And we now see so much of those systems being displaced through the rhetoric of flexibility. And flexibility is often, for years, whether that was to do with outsourcing, whether that is to do with technology, it's often posed as there's a benefit in it for you, the employee. And when I look at my own particular area, when I look at this idea of working hours and the extension of working hours, when we look at right to disconnect, it's often flexibility is talked about in the sense of, well, we wouldn't want to introduce any kind of legislation that would limit someone's flexibility, because we always talk about it as substitution. So you're substituting the hours that you might have spent working during the day, working in the evening instead, because it suits you. And that narrative, of course, then, whilst it's true for some individuals, plays into the arms of actually not just creating work substitution, but actually creating work extension. Because what we're finding is that workers aren't just substituting hours in the morning for hours in the evening. They're taking on those hours in the evening and adding to them as well. And that's one of the key difficulties that I think we need to look at, is we need to look at the wording of directives that are emerging. We need to look at codes of practice and look at them holistically. So, for example, the right to disconnect talks about the right to disengage from work and work-based communications. But the narrative that's in the media and the narrative that has been picked up by the employer side has focused only on the latter, work-based communications. So we see the soft approach coming out of organisations saying, let's everybody put an email footer talking about my hours might not be your hours. Let's encourage email headers that say things like, maybe you should send this, in the morning during more regulated working hours, for example. But it's not addressing the wider issue of the fact that, this is still leading to an extension of work, and it is still not addressing that former issue, which is disengaging from work activities, not just communications. So I think we have a lot to do in that regard in terms of regulation.
So, Michelle, how would you plays into the research you were talking about, particularly the idea of the phantom player and who creates the narrative of the phantom player, and what's likely to be the implications of that, perhaps for the performance, maybe, of those employees? That narrative.
Yeah, I think that's an important point about narrative, because, if you look at, we didn't, ask the employees specifically about, for example, resistance or so on, but you can see from the qualitative comments, and we can see from the interviews we did even pre-COVID about their attitudes to technology. And it's, some things haven't changed. Ida Hughes in the 1960s talked about people's perceptions of having an exclusion hypothesis, that technology someone else might lose their job but not me. A clay pigeon view, that is that, I'm kind of consumed to my fate and there's nothing I can do about it. And actually you could see those kind of thematic responses from the interviews that we did with employees. Now, these are employees who have a heightened level of awareness of the union. So you did have, some sense of, the union should do X, Y, and Z. But I think a big job for unions and for researchers is about the narrative that's presented to them. This idea that, technology is happening anyway. And of course, this is a long-term problem. Hobsbawm, when he was talking about the machine breakers in the 19th century, talked about the 19th century middle-class economic apologists, for kind of giving off this idea, things are moving on, get on board. And you can see this sort of narrative, this kind of acceptance that, technology isn't bad, but, what am I going to do about it? It's a behemoth that's rolling, and it's difficult for me to resist. That doesn't mean that there isn't agency, that there isn't resistance, but trying to tackle it is a difficult thing from the individual employees' perspective. That's why I think particularly the Financial Services Union Ireland has done a lot of work in this area, and they are trying to raise this consciousness amongst employees about trying to tackle it. But you do also see as well about, when you talk about conflicting tensions, managers have a big role here to play in conjunction with regulation. We saw managers who are very well aware about the negative effects of technology, and they have this conflicting role of trying to, impose the organizational objectives and execute their objectives, while at the same time trying to have some level of protection towards employees where they feel that the technology is too intrusive or doesn't take into account the reality of the working day. But we also see responses as well where, managers actively discouraged certain types of work extension. For example, where there was a unionized agreement on overtime, and then the manager's response was, well, there's overtime, I don't want you working late, I don't want you working on Saturdays. So where regulation is strong, where the costs imposed to introduce certain policies like work extension, or not a policy, but certain practices like work extension, then managers will carry it out. But where they have the flexibility to choose the tactics that they like, well, then it becomes difficult for employees to be able to capture that. I think if you're talking at a more philosophical level, we know that at a philosophical level, we do have this idea, that Sewell and Barker talked about, the coercion and care perspective, or the coercion and care grammar of technology. Where people see technology as used in an oppressive, coercive way, they're more likely to resist it in total. But where people see that there's some element of care, as Caroline talked about, where there's some element of a narrative that technology is in some way good for you, then it becomes about negotiating points, negotiating the more practical elements as opposed to the principle of technology. And really, that's where, when Aida talks about the regulation, that's the philosophical underpinning. It's this one of care where, we're going to negotiate as opposed to resist the technology in total. But trying to raise employees' consciousness about the narrative, I think, is an important, at least, first step, which is a precondition to trying to get better regulation in the first place from the government.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And technology, obviously my mic failed, so I've been given a new one. As I'm just looking online, I can see one or two sort of comments and stuff. I might invite Jackie, if Jackie is online, to come back in, and perhaps there might be one or two questions or comments from the online audience that Jackie might be able to bring in. If Gary
There's a
can
comment
over.
from Jenny O'Neill about in response to Gareth's question about occupational health and safety. She says it's about ergonomics. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get Jenny to say something herself, but the other, there's also, for those of us online, we have the privilege of sharing stuff in a way you don't quite at the moment. So there's also work from Phoebe Moore in the UK about occupational health and safety in the digital age and with AI. And just in relation to some of her work and other work we've been doing at the Digit Centre, I'm just wondering if there's two things. One is we need to have a better differentiation of different types of connected workers. So there are clearly white collar and manual workers, and the nature of the kind of digital connections they have are just very, very different. So whether they're wearing sensory wearables to monitor their performance, or whether it's that they are answering shed loads of email, people like us, they're quite different types of environments they're working in, about how that their work limits are limited or not. So I think, one, we need to do that. And secondly, I had a question to Gareth, was particularly when you were talking about performance management, etc., and we know all the challenges of it, is it possible there may actually be a good side to this? So for example, sometimes that reminds me of when the REF, the Research Excellence or Research Assessment Exercise came in the UK. In the past, you would have the great and the good, usually the older, maler and paler members of our departments might have very high reputation, both of themselves. But when you had to have these metrics saying how many articles have you published, what's the status of those journals, you actually saw that some people who may not have the same level of conveying how brilliant they were, suddenly said, well, have you noticed that so-and-so has published, for example, in our field, a very good article that's very highly rated, or they brought in a lot of money, and they were actually getting recognition for their performance in a way that the stereotypes of who was very clever in the past were being questioned. So as a provocation was to say, do you think that there's some way of maybe turning this around, that it might have a more positive equality and diversity effect? Then we have one side, which is clearly it's about, some of it's about surveillance and, you know, really constrained management. So there's several things going on there. One is the ergonomics, one is the occupational health and safety for different workers, and three is an EDI element that might make it somewhat positive. And that might be open to the rest of the panel if you fancy that as well. I hope I captured some of the comments that were in the chat so far.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Is there any other final questions? I'm conscious of the time. Is there anyone in the audience who has anything burning to comment and ask? No. Well, we might bring it to a close. We're sort of 7 or 8 minutes over what the allocated time was, but just to thank the panel for their contributions, to thank the audience, to thank Jackie and SASE and Jacob in particular, along with Rachel and Richard and Christine at the IT and Research Week office for UL. And the issue that Jackie has raised, you know, as a provocation, there might be something positive to it. Connecting that to some of the issues Gareth mentioned, to some of the issues Caroline and Michelle and Ada have drawn on, is back to this ongoing societal debate, is that technology is not deterministic. Technology is shaped by social relations as much as the economic models, the econometric equations, the accountancy formulas. All of those profit-driven matrix tend to bypass and ignore the social and humanistic side. And it's that which sort of brings us back to our area of expertise, to our area of interest, and which we can make a substantial contribution to some of those debates going forward. So thanks, everyone. And for those who are online, I hope you enjoy your digital social space, which follows on after this. Thank you very much. Bye.